7 young Native Canadians finished a 1,600-kilometer trek to the capital in protest against living conditions on reserves. Back in January, they set out on a journey from a town in Quebec that included travel by snowshoes and sleds. After arriving in Ottawa on Monday, the protesting Natives were joined by hundreds of demonstrators outside the Canadian Parliament. The protesters are complaining about the poor living conditions of Indigenous Canadians. They say little has been done to address a severe shortage of housing and schools on the reserves. They also say that Prime Minister Stephen Harper's policies have resulted in acute poverty for Native communities. Joshua Blakeney is a correspondent who joins us from Calgary. Joshua Blakeney, we have another act here reminiscent of the lady who went on a hunger strike, but I'm wondering, these types of acts may lead, maybe, to something being done about the plight of the Indigenous people there in Canada? What do you think?
Well, Kaveh, is certainly raising a discussion and drawing attention to the fact that there's been a breakdown in communication between the Canadian state and the various First Nations in this country, who would like to see Canada be similar to the European Union, where you have sovereign nations, sovereign Indigenous nations, deciding their own fate, deciding their own self-determination, and negotiating on a nation-to-nation basis with the Crown, with the Canadian state. That is actually Canada's heritage. Canada was built on an alliance between the British Crown and the First Nations peoples of this country, who defended this country against the United States, who wanted to incorporate Canada into the United States. So there's a long history of Crown Aboriginal relations being quite good. But unfortunately, the Harper government is aligning itself with the resource companies. Obviously, Canada has the 3rd largest oil reserves in the world, the 2nd largest uranium reserves. It's a resource superpower. And the Harper government is more interested in ingratiating himself with the CEOs and shareholders of these major multinational corporations than with the Aboriginal peoples, who often are small in numbers, who live in the rural populations of Canada and whose voice isn't heard. And that's why we're seeing gestures like the hunger strike, the Gandhian-style hunger strike of Chief Theresa Spence, and now this march, which I would say is almost analogous with the salt marches of Gandhi, where these brave, courageous young Aboriginal individuals marched 1,600 kilometers from James Bay, in a very frosty part of the world, to Ottawa. Now, a piece of evidence to support what I've just suggested about the priorities of the Harper government is the fact that rather than going to meet these courageous Aboriginal youth, Prime Minister Stephen Harper flew to Toronto to welcome some pandas from China that will end up in the Toronto Zoo. I'm not making this up. Stephen Harper went to Toronto to welcome 2 pandas that are coming, because obviously China is investing heavily in Canada's oil deposits in the Alberta tar sands around here where I live. And so Stephen Harper was more interested in currying favor perhaps with China, who's investing here, than with welcoming these Aboriginal youth. An opposition member of Parliament did raise an interesting point, that imagine if these youth had been white and had decided to march 1,600 kilometers for something that was not related to Aboriginal affairs and Aboriginal politics. I think we can be sure that members of the Conservative government would have been there welcoming them. And so there has been the fact that these Aboriginal youth have received the cold shoulder from members of the Harper government, that this is another sign that the Harper government is not really interested in perpetuating Canada's comparatively good Crown Aboriginal relations, but rather wants to amend all the laws that protect and uphold Aboriginal rights in order to pave the way for the plundering of Canada's resources.
Well, thank you for putting that into context, especially regarding Stephen Harper's welcoming of the pandas. We appreciate that. Joshua Blakeney there from Calgary. The President of Cyprus acknowledges that the terms of the Eurozone bailout deal he struck in Brussels were painful. Nikos Anastasiades has said, however, that the island is now able to make a fresh start after having come a breath away from collapse.